So, Joanna, I'm very excited to be in conversation with you today. How are you?
Delighted to be here. Thank you, Natalie. Very
And all
well.
your...
How are you?
I'm all right. It is that kind of snuffle season. I'm wearing layers. I was like,
Oh
trying
no,
myself a
I
bit.
know.
I
I
know, just like
know. I'll
wrapping
be
up.
like this. Yeah.
So I'm going to start with the bigger question. Well, they're all big questions, I think, especially this theme that we're going to be unpacking today, or themes. But what do you, if you were to imagine that we had a global human psyche, however you conceive that to be, what would you sense or say is going on at this moment in time in that global human psyche?
Yes. Well, we do have a global human psyche, and actually, this is, I think, very much what you're working on. I'm trying to write on this sense that when we talk about AI is the global human psyche. It's been
Ooh.
made of all of us. And the situation at the moment then is that the kind of companies that govern it and run it and make money from it are using all of our resources. They're using a massive kind of historical database of psyche. And it's the past, it's our past psyche as well. So I think I'd say that the global human psyche is there, it's present, and it's being kind of used by others than us. And I think that's in a way the question. I think that probably then there's a questioning psyche, which is in fact something that I'm working on at the moment, that question, what the hell is going on?
Yeah.
I think that's the question, what the hell is going on? How has this happened? And how can we rework this so that in fact all of this amazing index of minds and thoughts can be somehow part of as you working on a flourishing future, an interesting conversation moving forward that isn't just being controlled and hemmed in by people who are making money out of it.
Do you know, I'm actually quite surprised by that answer. It makes fabulous sense, but I'd never considered it in that way. And it does feel a little bit sort of the image that it conjures for me as you're sort of describing this is it's like a grab and a calcification of a psyche which has been made explicit. Well, and I suppose implicit in terms of the stuff that we read in images and video that's not spelt out. But it's like a grab and a crystallization of the expression of some psyches online, which is historic, with a view to shaping the living, breathing, plural psyche of the world going forward. So like there's kind of this, and we know that only so much is expressed online. And then, is the darknet the subconscious of that global human AI psyche? I don't know. I don't even know if I have a, it just raises a lot of questions because it's a very it's a thin slice of the richness of what actually exists somehow.
Yes. And that we've all started, it's so interesting about writing as well. And as someone, I try and write books, and I really notice this, and your listeners will remember if they were sort of around at that time, that point where we all started writing emails. And there was that strange transition from, it was a written form, but we were producing it at the rate of thought.
Yes.
And whereas previously you might have written a letter and sort of thought about it quite closely and drafted it, but we had this new medium. It was really interesting, which was kind of where we committed something perpetually into writing that lived there forever, but it had been expressed at the speed of speech, as we might previously have had quite throwaway conversations that vanished. And so that's really interesting as well, that there's an anecdote, and again, I haven't got a citation for this, but there's an anecdote that one year Google was going to do a zeitgeist of the year based on Google searches, because they saw that a Google search was a kind of zeitgeist. It was an index of people's, as you say, their concerns, their thoughts. And someone said, don't do this because we don't want people to know that we can see these thoughts, that this is so intimate that we get this distilled sense of what everyone's thinking about. So there's been a massive shift, which you're working on as well, this enormous shift that we're living through and that we've witnessed and that we are it as well, because it is us, it's using us and our lives and our thoughts.
So I've got so many questions written down here, but I'm going to kind of unpack it. It's going to be a choose your own adventure into which territory you want to explore next.
Sorry, and that's slightly like my answers. My answers are like,
This is brilliant. It's like my happy place, one of my very happy places.
So please interrupt me as well.
No, I'm here for the ride. So two things. One of them was about, earlier you mentioned about how all of the historical information, including works of great literature and fiction and art and music, and at some point we can imagine theatre that has been video recorded that can then get understood and replicated and all the rest of it. That's all been mined without consent. And I know that Jaron Lanier talks about this in terms of data and social media, that we're kind of contributing in a way that is not remunerated in any meaningful way. And so that's one thing, is kind of, it just, when you actually see it in those terms, it feels grotesquely unfair. And what do we do about that? And the second thing is, what was the second thing? It was around... Okay, well, it's gone for now. So maybe let's just go with that for now until the second thing comes back.
Yeah, Jaron Lanier is such an interesting figure as well. So that's absolutely right. I was thinking about this in terms of the early 20th century as well. I grew up reading modernists and studying them, and they're living through that moment of technological change in the early 20th century. You have amazing technologies coming online, flight, speed, and you have a lot of embrace of that by artists. You have people like Henri Gardia-Bresca, the vorticists. They're really into the machines. And then Gardia-Bresca tragically is killed in the First World War, which is this massive mechanized war in which the old chivalric order meets this huge crunching mechanization, and people are just decimated in massive numbers, never before seen. And there's this huge crisis in art about that clash. And you get lots and lots of responses on both sides of the war. And I was thinking about that at the beginning. You mentioned Jaron Lanier, and that's such a good person to raise, because he writes about that early sense of the internet as this place of capacious possibility, and a place where you could have a conversation across boundaries of wealth and position and age and class and race. And this should have been an option to do this. And you then have inevitably these kind of power grabs that come in, where people start to move in this very free domain initially and start to control it and lock it down and then monetize it. And there's that amazing point, Shoshana Zuboff, who you will have discussed a lot on this podcast, I'm sure.
She's cropped up. Actually, only a few times. So yes, bring her into the conversation. Yeah.
I was thinking maybe there's a point where everyone cites Zuboff. And she writes really interestingly about that point in the early noughts where the tech companies are under a bit of pressure. These quite new companies like Google, Facebook, they're getting a bit of grief from shareholders. They're not monetizing. And they suddenly realize they've got this massive resource, which is data, our information, our lives. And they monetize using that. And because the internet's so new, of course, as we all know, there's no legislation to counter this massive power grab. And it leads to what Zuboff calls world historic wealth creation, this never before seen level of wealth. I think, is it Francesca Bria who's worked in Barcelona? I know. Are you there at the moment?
I am there
in Barcelona. Yes. So Francesca Bria was the CTO of the city of Barcelona, as you know, and I think she's really, really interesting on that point. That kind of, you have those moments, these forks in the path where you could have gone another way, where either we could have chosen what data we shared and what we kept quite, to ourselves, or it was massively huge. Kind of, there would be layers of cryptographic layering to keep it private. But instead there was this complete governance really and kind of ultimate control. And I think she talks about, is it $3 trillion now that's sort of bound up in these companies, of which 1 trillion's offshore. So amazing.
And how much is taxed in any meaningful way. I mean,
exactly. So, I mean, which is a wealth that we've all created without really prior consent. So these are massive questions of power, democracy, transparency, ownership, in which we're drawn, whether we wanted to be drawn or not.
Yeah. And I think also one of the things that I really liked that you just said was about that capacious possibility at the early days of the internet. And I was thinking it's become, and I love these sorts of poetic, like rapacious probability now. It's a sense of mine everything and make them more probable what happens, and then it diminishes the potential avenues for something different to emerge.
I love that, from the capacious to the rapacious.
Yeah.
That's exactly it, yeah, as you said.
And I think because it's just this kind of, I don't know, it just seems to be a similar need expressed in a really unsettling way. So when people talk about different revolutions, and I'm curious what your perspective is here, they'll say, oh yes, but it's like the technological, and I'm like, it's not, because the technological revolution couldn't think for itself. And it's not that AI can think for itself necessarily, but it can simulate certain functions of human thought, which, if unfettered by values, intentions, safeguards, and the rest of it, can end up causing great damage and affecting the physical world. If you're thinking about things like autonomous warfare, or even simple things like agentic AI, people saying, so a few of the people that I've met recently at some of these events, often people in high leadership positions will say, oh, isn't this amazing? We're just going to cut our costs and the revenues will go up. And I'm like, yeah, but on what kind of length of term are you thinking? And they're, oh yeah, a fairly short term. I was like, yes, but how many people are going to get fired? Oh, it's just adjustment. They'll find other jobs. I'm like, okay, but when the millions of people who enter that kind of gray zone of needing to skill up, but actually many of the skills that they need are fast becoming redundant, if the hype is to be believed, which is a whole nother question, that's a good one to, I want to dig into that with you too, then how do they skill up? And then aren't they just gutting that middle class, which, and the other classes, but that middle class, which they depend upon to be able to sell their shit to? It's like, you're cannibalizing your own market. Wake up. And it's like, well, we're fine. I'm like, yeah, but you're not going to be. Let's think more wisely. Like, let's use it to augment our intelligence, not, cannibalize our discernment and restraint and wisdom and long-term.
And it's odd, isn't it? The idea of, there comes a point where the society's been so ruined potentially, and this is the dystopian scenario that is kind of flickering all the time at the edge of our fiction and our art and our cinema. Where's the point where the society is so messed up by this that it's unpleasant even for the super rich?
Yeah.
And of course, then what do? Well, they've got escape plans, and they've got obviously New Zealand, and they've got other places that they're intending, and they're out in space now with again this is another power grab of an unregulated, or to them unregulated place, and it's an extraordinary further reach that they're now emanating into. But you think, is that partly a calculation that if they mess everything up so much here, they have another place? Who knows?
Maybe. And also, I just find it so, it's so infantile. It's like, well, we couldn't decolonize Earth, let's go colonize Mars. And the irony doesn't, it's like, I just find it phenomenally funny and also chronically disheartening. It's So we talked a little bit about the trajectory of the internet at the beginning of the conversation, and I want to ask you about the trajectory of where you think emerging technologies are potentially taking us, which is a huge question. But where does that bring your mind to in terms of what areas you might be focusing on, or any trends that you're particularly interested in?
Yeah. Well, I was saying, because I wrote the last novel I published. I've just finished one that's coming out, which is kind of about the near past. It's an imagined near past. So the early internet, like the first decade of the 21st century, which I'm really interested in. But the one I published before was called Z, and that was an imagined near future. Really taking lots and lots of emerging technologies. And I was writing it in 2017, 2018. So you had then robotics, you had the Internet of Things, you had a kind of smart system around you with your fridge monitoring you, as well as your kind of watch, or your intimate environment that would then be an assisting technology, but also an observing technology. And then other things like driverless cars and autonomous weaponry, as you mentioned. And I just wanted to look at, so that I didn't invent any technology at all. It was all completely technology that was entirely developed and about to emerge into our day-to-day lives. And I was just really interested in what happens if you push that into our surveillance economy and it becomes just this enormous moving system where everything is watching us all. And who's it sending? Who's behind the eyes? If everything is a kind of eye, what is behind the eyes? And you already made the point that the AI isn't an interiority and a consciousness behind the eyes. There's something else. But it feels to us almost as if it is when we interact with Alexa or Siri or whoever, whatever. Sorry, whoever. It's already happening.
I know.
But these entities kind of start to deceive us into suggesting an interaction with an equal consciousness. But again, it's really that we're interacting with a massive mirror to ourselves and our own lives and our past, that the entire past of the humans that have been all of our data that's been put into this system. So I was really interested in that, looking at, and this question you raised, actually, this question of a panopticon, and that's really about technology. Again, it's about these forks in the path, that the panopticon, taking us back to Jeremy Bentham in the late 18th century, just because you have the technology to build a house, it doesn't mean you have to build a panopticon. And just because you have the technology to do what we're doing at the moment, the tech that is available, you don't have to make it a tech panopticon. That doesn't have to be the automatic part of it. And we have this notion of inevitability that we're told, if you want the good parts, you have to have the rest. And that's just not correct at all.
But it's tricky, isn't it? Because I think there's this, and this, I think, in large part connects with the idea of techno-determinism, that the future of humanity and its quote-unquote progress will be guided by technological advancement. And that's well and good if you've got a plurality of voices at the table who, with care and intent, are thinking about what values to embed in the technology so that they're going towards. But then that's not so much techno-determinism. Because I think when I think of techno-determinism, I think, well, it's just going to be the incentives of mining as much data as you can, so you can monetize as much as you can, so you can get a high valuation, and you can make fuckloads of money at everyone else's expense. Like that's, I know but that's basically, and then we get some of the benefits, which is great. I love technology. We get to have this conversation on Riverside, and exactly. So it's really easy to slip into this idea that we have no agency, and that, like you say, this is the inevitable way in which things are going to be. And if you want the good, you have to take it with the bad. How do we give people a sense that there is a different possibility and possibilities, and that they can take an active role in shaping our collective futures?
Yes, exactly. So we need, instead of this top down, you must have this, this is what you get. We need totally participatory democracy. And we need, and there have been already, actually, Barcelona as an example, we need massively imaginative test case schemes where we are all invited into this technology. So, for example, we're invited to make decisions about data sovereignty, about what we share, what we are prepared to emit into this massive system, what will actually be interesting for us to present to other people, and what we want to keep hidden, and without any of this shaming and without any of this accusations of being a Luddite. We had all of these from the big tech companies, that if you're not coming with the revolution, you're a big Luddite and you want to stay in the past and you don't want everyone else to get this tech. There was a lot of that kind of manipulation. But when, of course, questions of sovereignty, data sovereignty, democracy, self-determinism, these are not Luddite questions. They're absolutely fundamental, past, present, future. And so I think that question of who owns everything, of ownership, this is us. And again, there's this notion somehow, because it's called data, there's this notion that it's this abstracted, inhuman resource that has nothing to do with the humans that have actually been moved within this system. We've all been part of this. We've all lived within it. And we've benefited, as you say, enormously from so many aspects of it. But we should be able to have those benefits without these massive detriments that erode our own ability to participate in the democracy. And I think it's a bit like, I remember doing a talk once about it, and the question was given to someone on a panel that I was on. I think actually Zubov was speaking on the panel too. And I think we were asked, not in a confrontational way, but just someone interested, just saying, how do I communicate with my relatives? They live very far away. I really need this technology like Facebook. And that's, at the moment, you're told, if you don't like it, don't use it. But that's a bit like saying the road outside your house is appalling and really dangerous, so just don't leave your house if you don't like it. We'd obviously really hope that there'd be another answer to that question. So I think there's a massive crisis of trust, which we've now got because of all this manipulation and this lack of being honest about what's happening. I think it's caused this huge crisis. So that's exacerbated, I think, various problems within how we talk about this. It's become that nobody trusts any person who's trying to, I guess, there's a sort of notion now that anybody who's in well, I have this notion anyway, I always have this notion, anyone who's in the public eye can't be trusted at all.
Yeah.
And so that's causing a huge detriment within our societies, that we don't trust anyone who's actually in a position to do anything, which is sort of reasonable in one level, but also how do we go forward from there?
Yeah. So there's something, I remember now what it was that I was going to say at the beginning, which I then probably forgot, but you've touched on it again, and I'd like to go there. So when you mentioned earlier about Google being able to do a report about what people have been searching,
yes, yeah.
and I was thinking, okay, well, if you can infer, which one can, and sometimes you don't even need to infer because the evidence is explicit and it's there. If you can infer things as intimate as things around identity, so it could be sexual preference, it could be religion, values, politics, all that kind of stuff, which we've seen happen back in 2012 with Facebook. It was able to basically extract off of your likes all sorts of really intimate information. But if Google are able to do that back then, and now we've got things like the Ray-Ban Meta glasses, which there are these two students that basically figured out how to use it to dox people. In real time, if I saw you in the street and I didn't know who you are, I would get an image up of you, and then it would give me your name, your address, your phone number, names of your relatives, the books that you've written, the one that you're writing, if that was somewhere on a blog online. And then all that data would be available to me in real time to be able to do with it what I will. And so I could then come up and go, oh, you're Joanna, aren't you? And you've written this, but even if I knew nothing about you, and you'd be like, oh, interesting. So at that level, there's kind of that social engineering piece, but also cognitive liberty. Like, we don't need to wait until we've all got, and this is not what I'm going for here, but like Neuralink, sort of, and we've become kind of a node in the Borg empire of Musk or whatever. But we do need to think about cognitive liberty, because even if we're not injected by technology, we can still be really impacted by the data that's out there and how it's used without our knowledge, consent, and without any recourse if it's used without. So what are your thoughts around cognitive liberty and where the biggest risks are and what we can do about protecting it?
Yeah, and again, I think there's been a kind of demonization. I think this idea that if you've got something to hide, you're going to be concerned about this. So why are you so worried about your privacy? All these kinds of, this suggestion that if we are concerned about being absolutely open and totally naked before those who have control, that we are in some sense being dubious. And so again, I think removing a lot of that strange insinuating accusation from this debate, or resisting it when we try to talk about it, I think is really important. And yes, I think I always think in this of Zamyatin, which is a book that is published into an English translation in 1924, and which influences both Huxley and Orwell. Orwell reviews it 3 years before he writes 1984. And in that, one of the kind of ways in which the society controls people is it makes them live in completely transparent buildings, in glass houses, with, again, this idea that if you can't be viewed all the time, then what's wrong with you? What are you trying to do? So I think that's such a fundamental thing about, again, choosing when to be evident and when to not be, when to be hidden and private. And again, this idea, I think, of prior consent to things is so incredibly critical. We had this notion that because tech was so exciting, it was moving so quickly, it wasn't really time to explain it. And this sort of mystification of it as well, this idea that only a few really cool people in, the West Coast of America could actually understand it, and none of us will be able to grasp it. And so let's just keep moving it, and isn't this thrilling? And you'll all get to benefit. And I think to change that entire conversation, this is a huge seismic technology. It's totally unprecedented in human history. We're all part of it. It's using our lives, and we can understand what's going on. It's quite simple, actually. There was loads of data. Initially, it was a sort of surplus. Then it was realized that it could be sold. And then it was realized that you could predict people's behavior from it, which was very useful to people who wanted to advertise to us and sell us things. And then there was a further realization, which of course you have worked on a lot, which was that we could then, it was much better if your predictions came true, because then they're far more effective. So this whole nudge architecture was developed, and people were winning Nobel Prizes for this. Taylor won a Nobel Prize for it, for creating and looking at ways in which, and again, you can see there are ways that we can debate uses of that. if we're all participants,
Yeah.
we're given information, we can make informed decisions. That's all really great. But there's also where it's being done in this paternalistic, hidden way, it immediately becomes, again, another way in which our democratic agency is removed and our autonomy and our freedom. And I was trying to write a lot about that as well. The point, almost what's, you know, there's that sort of, what's the fear of us as autonomous, free agents? Why would societies demonize that, become afraid of it? Well, because there's so much money involved in creating another system at this point.
Yeah, it's quite mad when you start to think about the because at its root we're talking about systemic change. If you're talking about participatory democracy, making visible and concrete and tangible the abstractions that have been used to sell us this fantastical idea. One of the things at this the event that I was at yesterday or the day before, I forget now, Data Fam Tableau, there was this amazing woman, Caroline Carruthers, I think. I don't know how one pronounces her surname, but she's done lots of really interesting work with charities and with the Met. And she gave this quite chilling example of what's actually happening as a metaphor, but essentially what's actually happening with our data. So imagine that someone says to you, like, you meet some bloke on the street, because they are principally blokes. I love blokes, but like we are being run by tech firms, principally run by a handful of these particular chaps. Anyway, so imagine someone comes up to you in the street and they say, right, I'm just gonna follow you now. And they follow you to your house. And at your house, there's, you know, either your kid or your nephew, some young person. They go, okay, I'm just now going to follow your kid. And I'm going to follow them into the bathroom. And I'm going to follow them into their bedroom and into their school. And I'm going to be with them all of the time, even when they're sleeping. You would say no. You'd be like, what is this? This is a huge invasion. And yet, when big tech companies say, well, we just want to put an app on your phone and we want to pay you £5 a month for the privilege, that's essentially what they're doing. But because it's not graspable, because we are embodied beings and we see risks that are close rather than those that are far, again, that's kind of playing on our, I suppose, evolutionarily adaptive psychological propensity to kind of save ourselves in the short term without actually causing big problems to our security in the long term. And I think that's it. It's like, because it feels abstract and the costs are further down the line, we don't grapple with them appropriately. So then how do we, and I thought that was such a striking image. I thought, this is exactly what's happening, except it's not just one bloke, it's millions of people, you know, it doesn't have to be a bloke, people who are making loads of money off it. And it's like they're all in your bedroom or in your loo, like, you know.
Yeah. And it's a bit like, then they come in and they say, I'm going to watch you while you sleep. And then they leave a window open for some other people to climb in through your window to come in and watch, you know, so there's a whole
even worse
cumulative effect. And they say, oh, I'm really sorry. Yeah, we didn't realize we left that window open. All these kind of bad actors have now come in. We were really nice and we loved watching you sleeping, but all these bad people were not responsible, etc. It's that kind of thing too. So yes, that's really true. And I think it's so interesting. And I'm still trying to work out my thoughts on this in a way, this question with AI and this question with this observational tech, that initially we were meant to be consoled. They said to us, don't worry, it's not human. There's nothing real watching you. It's just this abstract, as you say, this impersonal accumulation and response. So, for example, when you speak to your helpful Alexa assistant and you're not really talking, it's listening to you, but it's not someone real, so it doesn't matter. You're not really being watched. But then, of course, now we have this question, as you raise, what's behind that? And again, this question, what's behind the eye? What's behind the digital voice? And of course, there are people transcribing, there are people training the AI. It's all being, you know, interfaced with human people as well, human people. So confused, the sort of terminology as well, because this kind of actor, human actor, non-human actor pretending to be human, the whole sort of thing. And so you have that further then question. And then this odd thing we get, I've noticed it a lot in cinema, this kind of cute AI motif as well. This AI is just your pal. It's just really nice. And this sort of humanization into this idea of AI being a kind of loving friend and a companion. And lots of people are very lonely, of course. Lots of us you had the pandemic. living these more and more atomized lives. So again, that could be very consoling, but again, what's the further perimeter of it? Who else is actually participating? You think you're having a relationship with a kind of AI friend, but actually, as you say, there's this whole watchful system beyond at the moment. So again, I think a lot of the potential boons are currently part of this very, very dysfunctional system, which we all need to try to change. There was something else, but I'll come to that later.
You sure?
I think I was just, robots. Well, I thought we could talk about robots.
Let's talk about robots. And I have to say, like, before we even get into the topic about, like, I'm a big Star Trek fan, and I always loved Data.
Yeah. No,
but
I love sci-fi. Yeah.
Me too. But Data was always trying to become more human, and he would try making jokes, and the whole beautiful narrative arc of this character was that he would start to gain a sense of what it means to have emotion, and it was kind of this mysterious beauty, the interiority, as you mentioned earlier, this subjective, I don't know, like this extraordinary sense of there being another world which is perhaps not visible to the naked eye. I don't know, just lovely. And so I feel quite tenderly towards that, but that is not the trajectory that we're on.
No. That's right. I mean, I love, for example, I always think about Solaris, Stanislav Lem, and this idea. And there is that possibility. You sort of think, the people who are controlling things claim that they're in control of all this. And of course, there's also that possibility that obviously, because humans can't imagine and control everything that's possible in our immense universe. So something happens that nobody's anticipated. And also, if your AI is an index of the past, then it's not really predicting the utterly unexpected, utterly anomalous event that's never, ever happened.
Yeah.
And so there's that possibility as well with the best algorithmic predictions. You've still got that complete possibility for something that is utterly surprising. But I think with Solaris, that question all the time, what Stanislav Lem does is he says, if we want to make sci-fi, which is a wonderful, amazing philosophical genre, let's imagine an entity that humans just cannot understand, that's got motives we can in no way fathom. And how do we interact with that? And I think that's quite an interesting question that we're kind of, there's always that possibility that you have completely missed something about reality, that there's something that none of us is remotely capable. And also because we're using language all the time, there's something beyond language that we just can't in any sense access. So I think those questions are almost in the gaps. I think there's a Lotman quote, reality's in the gaps. And I often think about that there's something else that we're always trying to reach towards that just can't be accessed by any of our linguistic mathematical frameworks. So again, if you believe in a totalized system of data, that will be missing masses and masses of things. You'll be missing so much that's actually resonant and in some sense incredibly apparent at another level. But robots, go on. Well, no, I was only thinking about robots because I did a panel about the AI apocalypse in Oxford, and just what the hell is going on with the AI apocalypse, and where what how, who's talking kind of seriously about the possibilities of AI and so on. And there was I was joined on that by a great writer called Lauren Scott. And a filmmaker called David Malone, who's done a brilliant film, We Need to Talk About AI. And Lauren Scott's written a beautiful book called Picnic, Lightning, all about living, in a digital age. But I mention it because there was an amazing guy who came up at the end, who I'll keep off the record because he didn't go on the record, but he works on robotics. And he said he was shocked as an expert on robotics by the speed of acceleration of robotics technology.
Wow.
And the fact that he gave a really good example, I thought, of robo baristas that used to be really rubbish, and they'd make the coffee and they'd drop the cup and it would take them ages. And now they're just brilliant. They can make the coffee in seconds. They're amazing. But also, if you tap them into a ChatGPT system, they can tell you anything. They can tell you about your health, about your future, about what's going to, they can offer
a coffee making Oracle AI, basically.
An Oracle, yes. It's like if the Oracle could make a brilliant espresso. It's like that, really quickly.
Wow.
And so that's quite astonishing, really, to have that in your local Starbucks. So what do we do with that? And also, of course, robo police you have pre-crime. We already have that technology. So these are much more sinister applications of that. that you'll have a robot walking down your street with as you say, the total knowledge of you and everything you've ever done, and with an algorithmic process that it's going to use to predict what we're all going to do, which is a truly, I think, nightmarish scenario.
That's horrific. I was talking with someone about this the other day about not this specifically, but the kind of the opposite of this. There was an amazing talk that I was listening to that was published in 2023 between Daniel Schmachtenberger, John Vervaeke, and Emma Gilchrist, and they were talking about what can we do in order to address the polar crisis, which is itself a huge question, but that was kind of the grounds for their conversation. And one of the things that came off the back of that, I'll come back to that in a sec because I don't want to lose it, but the conversation that spun off of that with a friend of mine was around what happens if you can predict everything and stop certain things from happening and the rest of it. And what does that do to our subjective experience of life and being human and the rest of it? And then I was remembering this beautiful, it was like a little essay, but there's an audio of it, of Alan Watts, that Zen kind of Western teacher from the 60s, 70s. And he was talking about imagining if there was one single entity, and I mean, you can call it God, you can call it the mind, whatever you want to call it, but some kind of intelligent entity that knows everything. And because of its omnipotence and omniscience, it's bored, it gets bored. And it's like, well, what if suddenly a red button appears in this everything that is everything, and it can choose to hit the button, metaphorically, and chaos starts creeping in. And you say, I want a little bit of chaos. And then you want more chaos and more chaos, until you get to the point, and he talks you through this beautiful meditation, until you get to the point where that chaos is you, Joanna Kavenna, living your life right now, not knowing what's going to come next out of my mouth, or, you know, what's going to happen when you walk out of the front door, and how exhilarating at some level it is. And I like it, kind of coming back to your point and about the polar crisis and some of the themes that come up for them, which is if we're moving in the opposite direction, where we are trying to account for, predict, and eliminate chaos, then what does it mean to be alive? Or the same thing with death. If we're trying, these longevity protocols, if we can't reduce the suffering and make the most out of the life that we're gifted here by sheer accident or whatever your cosmology is, how on earth, there's some weird perversions that we haven't actually, or that many people just don't seem to see are there or feel the need to address. And the kind of, sorry, go on.
Sorry, no, carry on.
I was just one final point. So about the chaos bit was between McGilchrist and the other two chaps, they ended up in this place in this discussion. It's like a 3.5 hour long conversation. It was fascinating, where they talk about how we need to be able to make space for the sacred and the numinous and the mystery. And there needs to be some sense of connection with awe. And you can't have that if everything is reducible, quantifiable, and knowable.
Exactly. That's so true. And that's right. I think they're both so good, McGilchrist and Vervaeke, on that question of meaning. And in a sense where you're told one ostensibly adamantine meaning of everything, as you say, where you're given allegedly this complete picture. And I'm joking really about the robo-barista that knows everything, because of course it wouldn't know crucial things which aren't available to that system. And it's a bit like a kind of digital Pythagoreanism, where there's an idea that everything can be encapsulated in numbers, and in this whole system of binary digits that we have online, this 0-1 system, and where everything is kind of one or the other, up, down, like, dislike. And so you separate everything into one of two values almost. That's the ideal. And so inevitably then, and as you get things going wider and wider apart, the gap gets bigger and bigger. And into that gap, in a sense, is everything else, and is potentially, as you say, chaos. That because it can't be calibrated, and it's sort of then ignored by that system that claims to be a total portrait but can't ever be, because humans aren't mathematical. We're so much more complex, and we do things for no reason sometimes, or no discernible reason, no reason that you can calibrate. So there's so much uncertainty intrinsic. And I think that's a really interesting point you raise, and I was trying to do that with this novel, Z. Z was a term actually for things that don't fit within the mathematical system, within the algorithm. So there's this term called Z. And some people see it as chaos and horror, and some people see it as freedom. Because, of course, if you're trying to encapsulate everything in the system, you'd hate this unpredictable aspect. But, of course, that is intrinsic, as you say, to life, that humans are constantly dealing with an unpredictable universe and our own unpredictable selves. So I think that's such a critical point you raise. I was also thinking of, again, that crisis of meaning that both McGilchrist and Viveki talk about, that it's so interesting that we're all longing for something else. Even as these systems get more and more complete, our longing almost gets greater for something else. And I think that balance is really fascinating, that there's clearly something that we're not being nourished by something, some crucial aspect of that system can't nourish us at all.
And do you think it's because of that kind of this quest for information and knowledge? And if we can just put a name on everything, if we can just categorize and identify, then it's like, oh, that's okay. I'm fine. I know everything.
Yes. It's a bit like, oh, sorry, did you have...
No, that was it. Yeah.
Sorry. Yes. And I could just say yes.
Okay, we'll move on to the next question.
But Borges is great on this and many other things. And actually, when you were talking, I was thinking of Borges as the Aleph, about someone who has this sphere and they can see everything in it, and then they get incredibly bored because they know everything and it's really tedious. But he also has an idea about the celestial emporium, which is an attempt to categorize every single animal forever in the world. And of course it collapses, because you have the animals that shake when they're nervous, or the animals that look a bit like flies, or the animals that are in this category or other, and all these other comic categories, because all attempts to categorize tend to absurdity if they claim that their categories are ultimate and adamantine again, if there's no possibility that there's something else. And I also think it's a bit like when you are on those phone lines and you say you've got to choose 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
I hate those.
If you want to talk about your overdraft, and of course the immediate thing is I don't want to, I'm being forced to, etc. That sort of thing. That's the initial thing. So this verb is, but there's also a category that you're not given, which is none of the above. At all, ever, something else, elsewhere. And so that's that, in a way that could be the most powerful category.
Usually it would be if you're fucked off and you want to talk to a person who can actually solve your problem in less than 5 seconds. That one, I would like that one every time, please.
Or exactly. I'd like systemic change, like Natalie's talking about, that would be the kind of, so I just think that it's something about that notion we're being sold this idea that this is an encapsulating system that catches everything, and of course it doesn't at all. Masses and masses is then lost, and that's what I'm really interested in, what is then lost, and almost how not to get lost ourselves, how we don't get lost in this inordinate system that tells us what can be found about us, what's permissible, whereas there's so much else.
So I'm having to kind of accept within myself that there are so many questions that we're just not even going to get to touch in this conversation, but I want to talk more about that because that's interesting, and systemic change. So how do you think we can find ways not to get lost? And lost, sometimes one needs to get lost to be able to rediscover other things. There's also the kind of that aspect of it, but lost in the sense of completely untethered.
Yes.
Or however you might conceive of it. So when you describe lost, maybe it's helpful to start there, what you're thinking of, what you're pointing towards.
Yeah. Well, so I was thinking about this because I was thinking a lot about so again, this idea of capture and what's chosen to be captured, and everybody's probably done this thing where you get there's an example I use sometimes, which is a Google map for a hotel, and it's got an address and it's sending you to this hotel, but actually there's nothing there at all in reality. There's just literally it's a really bad hotel because there's no doors and no roof and no beds. And again, that odd thing that there's an enormous, that's a really evident, or, you get your Google map and it drives you towards a ravine, and that evident disparity between the map and the representation, the reality, the map and the territory. And at those points, it's a question really of what is taken as the reality. So, and do you have a system, which we kind of have sometimes at the moment, where the unreality is then replaced for the actual reality, and we're told that we're unreal. So this idea that the system of so-called reality presents itself as unquestionable.
So it's a civilizational gaslighting, basically.
Yes, exactly
machines.
that. And this idea that, what you're looking at something directly in front of you, but you're being told that actually can't be the case.
Yeah.
And with the hotel that doesn't exist. And again, I think that is such a fascinating sci-fi prospect in a way that I always think of it with spell check, if anybody's ever, with predictive text as well, and you're trying to type something and it just won't let you type it, and in the end you sort of give up. You just think, okay, I accept this value, this thing is not permitted at all, apparently, and you readapt your whatever you're writing. And I think that thing of being the human is obviously we're the entities that have created this entire AI thing. It's all of us kind of pushed into this entire system of capture. So the idea then that we're then told that we're the sort of problem, the anomaly, and we need to sort of accept this other glittering, apparently complete edifice. I think that is a huge thing to resist, and to do that in any way possible. So that's what I mean by the question of things getting lost. Sorry, you had another question as well, didn't you? Which probably about what actually should we all do?
Yeah. So what do you do, like in a practical way? So I think obviously calling out when it happens, when you go to on Google Maps, if you're trying to drive over a particular territory and there is a bridge, and then you show up and there's just no bridge and you have to go all the way back and take 3 hours, or whatever it might be. Apart from calling things out like that when we find them, because I think some of it feels a bit like this weird, what's the word I'm looking for? It's like a kind of a virtual enchantment of some kind. Like we've all been cast under this weird spell. And it's quite seductive, and it's hard to kind of point a finger and say, well, actually, I don't know. It's a similar thing with, and I hate this so much on LinkedIn, for instance, which I used to quite like, and I'm active on it because I have to be, or I feel like I have to be. That's another question. And it says, do you want to write a post with AI? My goal is to not have to spend any time on there and just talk about the things I like, and people just organically find me. And that happens sometimes. But then it's saying, well, if you want to be found, then you have to be visible. If you want to be visible, we know you're stressed, use AI. But then everyone potentially then uses AI, and it becomes this weird, it just completely cancels out any value that it might have had. And so there's also that side of things, which is the way in which it completely reshapes your expectations of yourself and the stuff that you start putting out. There's a lot of distortion going on somehow.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, it's good to try to take agency as much as possible, and that's great. But also these are massive, massive changes to our society, and we need actually entire recalibration at the level of legislation and democratic process. And so the idea that, in a sense, it's like the other crises that we're dealing with, kind of species extinction crises, or these enormous ecological crises. It's something of that order, where you have, for example, we have a digital supremacy war between the US and China. And of course, all of this data should be used as a public good. It should be used for better healthcare. It should be used for better lives. It should be used for discrete. If we're going to have smart technology, which is extraordinary technology, e.g., I come home and I clap my hands and my lights go on or off, or the system can calibrate what sort of heating needs, etc., and save money. But then that should be on a discrete loop, so none of the information is going anywhere else apart from within a single home.
Yeah. And
to change the entire, or as Francesca Bria says, you select if you want some information to go out. But this idea that you have no power at all over this incredibly important information that can be used to predict you and control you, and to predict and control populations on a mass level. So these are enormous questions. And I think there's been a total dereliction by governments that have completely totally failed to operate as the representatives of populations. They've just totally failed. And so this should be the basis of elections. It should be the basis of what our representatives are doing. And it's that kind of revolving door that has instead operated between big tech companies and governments, where people have gone in and out in positions, and there's been this cohesion, and at the level of the security services as well. That's obviously been, I think, in many senses, a total betrayal of democratic rights. So I think that's the critical thing. And it should, I mean, Zuboff just says legislation, and I think she's right on that. But how do you persuade government, companies to legislate when they're making an absolute fortune? And that has to be done by obviously governments taking the lead on that. But
so how do we pressure them? Well, that's it. It's like,
I mean, that's the problem. It's clear that has to be done. And we're told that we're going to be, fucked up financially if this happens, but we're being fucked up financially at the moment. So you kind of think, well, they have fucked everyone up financially anyway.
It's like we're in it, whether we like it or not.
That sort of idea that we're all cruising to a, rich and prosperous future has been completely obliterated, I think, by the current situation.
So what do you think we can do about it?
Yes. So I would say at the level of that has to be a massive change, democratic level, representatives that we get, people standing to do that in Parliament. Obviously then I think the arts will, so the capture of data, the use of data for AI without consent, the use of creative work, there's been a big, I think you sent it to me as well, the huge petition by lots and lots of creatives and musicians, artists about this use again of people's stuff without any permission in the creative industries to obviously then create AI versions. That again, these sort of protests are important, whether they do anything, let's see. I think it's really, really hard. I think at the level of putting erroneous inputs into the entire system, where you can do that just each morning for an hour, but what does that do? E.g. to sort of confuse the system. That's a tiny, tiny thing to do, to input, to search for fantastical characters, to confuse the ChatGPT. It gets confused very easily. If you ask it for fake poems, it will break really quickly and tell you that, yes, they exist. And it does get very confused very quickly. Cost ChatGPT an absolute fortune, by the way, for every single search request. It costs it a fortune because its whole infrastructure is so expensive. But I think it's the pressure on each one of us to feel it's something that, you and I have to solve here and now is very great because it's so critical. But I think, we're at the moment, the only possible massive change has to come at this absolute level where the whole shift goes from top down to people up. But there have been examples. I think the example in Barcelona is a good example of a genuine attempt to make change. And if people are interested, I'd really advise them to look at what happened when that was instigated. And there is also, there's UN, I mean, God, anyway, who knows?
Well, there's the EU AI Act and things like this. But I think these things seem to only really, these things, let me be a bit more specific. So I think big legislative change often only comes about when there's been sufficient suffering, and that the risk of things getting really, really bad increases the Overton window for political change to happen in a way that feels a bit more moderate. So, for instance, I was reading this book called History for Tomorrow by Roman Krasnarek, who was talking with me on the podcast, and he talks about how you end up with these kind of extreme flank effects. So if you have groups of people who are perceived by the establishment, and that's a key thing, to be at the extreme. So it could be Emmeline Pankhurst, or women putting themselves in front of carriages, or the Black Panthers, or people standing up because they don't want their children to be indoctrinated by, priests coming in and stealing them to put them in boarding houses, like whatever, at any point in history. That the subsequent laws that seemed impossible at a certain point often have come into legislation simply because the politicians didn't want there to be such a huge amount of devastation, that this seemed like a more moderate path forward. So it's like, okay, well, if we don't want everyone burning all the plantations after the Jamaica plantation fires that happened, then we need to make sure that we create laws to prevent it. And so then the question is, like, what's the equivalent in modern day? We're not talking, I don't want people to be losing their lives. None of us do. And yet it does seem to me that there need to be people who are fighting hard at the very edges so that there can be some kind of moderate benefit accrued to all of us, and to do that over time.
I think you're right. And I think at one level, I'm really interested in hope. and I know you've worked on this as well, and you did that beautiful painting, didn't you, for the Royal Society of Portrait Painters, which is about hope, isn't it? And I think, and I really loved that. And I thought, I'm really interested in that. How do you maintain hope in hopeless times? Because as you say, the trajectory looks like at the moment, things are getting harder and harder and harder, and the cost of living crisis is escalating, and a lot of the things that governments can take for granted from their populations in some periods of history, like that people will be peaceable, that whole kind of architecture and landscape is changing because people are under too much pressure. And that's been the case now, I would say, since the global financial crisis in 2007-8, that's been, people are under far too much pressure financially. And so that the kind of, again, this idea that the governments can predict a certain amount of patience from their populations, I think that has become a very complacent notion. And rightly, people are just totally exhausted with being told that they're on a kind of teleology and that things are getting better, because they're demonstrably not. So that we're in, again, it's a really, and the fact that it coincides with a lot of the rollout of a lot of the surveillance tech is really interesting, because it means that as things have spiraled more and more out of control in many ways, that there's been a massive financial crisis that no one predicted or no one did anything to avert, and other forms of loss of control. Actually, we're being more and more controlled by a surveillance tech system, so that it's a really unsustainable level of pressure, I think, on populations. And I if I were in government, which of course I'd never be, I'd never be allowed. They never let novelists do this sort of thing, quite rightly, But I just think, why wouldn't they be worried about the effects that's going to have, even if they're just, and the people who are running these tech companies, even if they're wholly sort of interested in their own thing, why wouldn't you think there's going to come a point where this gets unpleasant for me and my gang? It's so odd that there isn't that concern and calculation, and maybe it's just still a lack of belief or awareness. I don't know.
I think also superiority.
Yes.
And that there are, Schmachtenberger talks about this in terms of hyper agents. So finding ways to close, I'm paraphrasing a little here, but talking about closing the ecological niche for hyper agents who are ruthless and Machiavellian, narcissistic, psychopathic, because these folks who are very skilled and have those traits are generally the ones that make it most easily and quickly up the ranks, ascending into power, and then being able to wield that at a level most of us could only fantasize about if we were so inclined. So it's also that is like back to that systemic question of how do we not only galvanize people but change the system and the structure itself, so that those who don't necessarily want the power nonetheless have power. It's like kind of, you hear this as sort of these philosophical ideas of, the person that doesn't want power should be put in a position of leadership for however many years, because they're not, their incentives aren't misaligned with, I don't know. It's that's radical change we're talking about.
Yeah, I think also ethics. I was at Oxford for a bit last year, just like one of those sort of very kindly a college lets a writer in for a little bit. Just
I think you're very self-deprecating. It's more like, we need you, come and be our brains really for a period of time.
It was very kind of them. But I was really fascinated by the changing scenery there, where they've now got this big institute of ethics in AI, and that the premise of that institute is that the crisis in AI and the lack of ethics debate in AI is akin to the need a few decades ago for medical ethics, for a huge kind of conversation around medical ethics.
Digital Hippocratic Oath or something.
Exactly that. And so, but it's so interesting, isn't it, that's now being instigated, and it will be really interesting now to see the effects of that shortly. I went to the talk in London the other day, again about AI and ethics, with Shannon Valor, and Mark Cockleberg and Alan Defoe, who's working in DeepMind on questions precisely of this, and to see that conversation going on between philosophers, ethicists, and someone who's actually working within Google DeepMind is pretty interesting, because you think, again, it seemed like that was a novel encounter that they hadn't necessarily met before, which again, you think, well, these conversations we can't now go back in time, but it seems it's odd, and maybe that's unfair. Maybe they talk, that actually that's been going on for a long time. But so, there's that tension between the technology being extraordinary and the triumph of human ingenuity. And yet, as you say, all the people who are just trying to earn enough money, we're trying to support our children, we're trying to get by, and this idea of a kind of tech aristocracy just going further and further away from all the people who've contributed all the information, the lives, the time into this, actually not being in any way part of their sort of glorious
ascension.
Elite kind of ascension. Exactly. And that, as you say, will cause unrest, has caused unrest, causes greater unrest.
Yeah, and there are very real consequences to these things. I think they're probably closer than people think as well. It's so easy when you're not encountering those affected by your decisions on a day-to-day basis to imagine that they don't exist. It's kind of the idea of externalities. And if you're not privy to them, if you don't see them.
And to sort of demonize people as back in the past, whereas that's not it. People aren't back in the past. We're all in the present. It's just who's actually controlling the present, and that classic, whoever controls the present and the past is controlling the future. That's an absolute adage.
So I have so much more I want to ask you, but we are coming to time. So I'm going to ask you one more question in this bit, and then I'll ask you a deep questions round, which at some point I will post some of these somewhere on YouTube, but it hasn't happened yet. So on a rainy day when I have the time, that part of this conversation will go live too. But so my question to you is then, how do you orient yourself towards life and beauty on dark days?
That's such a good question. I guess I suspect, I'd love to know how other people answer this. And I suspect I'm going to be boringly perennial about this, really.
I doubt
I'm going to say my family, my children, my looking out the window, and I'm in a place in the sort of South Midlands at the moment, and there's a field outside with these cows that move very slowly, and if you open the window you can hear the sound of them chewing the grass and that extraordinary sound of cows eating. And I suppose that feeling of books and music and art and conversations, and a sense that there is a sort of tenuous, fluttering hope all the time, because I know so many people want to do something else, and I think that's what we all sort of deserve, to be able to participate in that conversation about what else we could all do. So that, I suppose, but how do you want to know? What's
my answer?
Yeah.
I think quite similar to yours. I think it's a way of paying attention. So you just described so many different ways of paying attention to the beauty that's around you and the different kinds of beauty that you notice. And it is beauty. It's things like picking up, I was walking through London yesterday, picking up a leaf that had turned this beautiful kind of crimson colour and just putting it in the sun and holding it and just looking at it it wasn't long, like 5 seconds. Or if I hear a bird that I don't know, that's a really weird call. And I'll stand, and if I'm not like really rushing off, look and see if I can find it. It's attending to life.
Yes.
And to that mystery of, I don't need to know what the bird is, but even just stopping and looking and listening gives me something which is expansive. And
I think yes. And sort of mystery that nobody really knows what's going on. And there's an incredible, beautiful mystery to the universe. And the people, I don't understand the people who say, no, this is definitely what's going on. You've all got to live by my rules. They're the ones who I find really, as you said, that what your description of people who want to take power.
Yeah.
Yes, but to try and maintain that other sense of mystery and beauty, which can be very consoling.
Yes. Right. So if people want to find you, where would you like to direct people? So also to check out your book, Zed. You haven't told us yet that I haven't asked you. Sorry, I got sidetracked. The name of your new book, when it comes out, and where people can get it, because you've written multiple books, which are all worth.
I think my next book's called Seven, and it's very much about this. It's set, as I said, slightly in the imagined near past, and just looking at the first, I think, this really critical first decade of the 21st century. And it's called Seven, and it's out with Faber in early 2026, I'm thinking.
Oh, it's miles
so
away.
not a while, yeah. But that's not their fault. I've only just handed it, yeah. So that's a little while ahead. But thank you, yeah. And Zed is out. You can buy it somewhere, I expect.
Okay, and your website?
Yeah. And my website is just joannakavenna.com. And I'm trying to establish it now, and a sort of ARG around my next novel. So to set up a sort of alternate reality around it, so that if there's a website in the novel, you can kind of go on it, and it's got a game in it. But hopefully I'll be able to let people play online. And actually the question within that novel is, the game is a very ancient game box that's been discovered and nobody knows the rules. So how do you play a game without rules, and whose rules are the ones that we all use in the end? So people make up their own rules to the game. So that will be coming. That's what I'm doing at the moment. That's what I'm kind of, I think I mentioned to you, sort of working towards at the moment.
That's so exciting.
So more to come if I can actually sort that out.
An actual Pandora's box of sorts.
Exactly. Yes. But this question will come: who makes the rules? Who gets to make the rules that we're all meant to deal with?
Okay. Well, and on that note, thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant.
You, Natalie.
I really enjoyed talking with you.
Such a pleasure. Thank you very much.